This is a big.
It's.
Her name.
Good afternoon, Senate Institutions, got a smaller crew today, but it's okay, we'll soldier through, we'll be fine. We have with us today, Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Department of Finance and Management, and Nicholas Kramer, Budget Analyst for Department of Finance and Management. And what we're looking to do is to go over the capital bill budget adjustment. Or actually the budget adjustment to see how it affects the capital bill, and these gentlemen are gonna walk us through that, so the floor is yours.
Wow, thank you. Adam Gresham, Commissioner of Finance and Management.
And Nick Kramer, budget analyst, Department of Finance and Management.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting us. So in the budget adjustment that we submitted a couple of weeks ago to the House, there's section 39 in there, which has an awful lot of sense. And that's because we are crossing out appropriations that they made in the big bill that we believe rightly should have been made in the capital bill. They're capital appropriations.
Right.
There, but they act in quack like capital appropriations, but they were paid for with general fund money upfront. That's makes them different. Most capital appropriations, we borrow the money in it. So we believe, because they are capital appropriations, regardless of how they are paid for, they should be in the capital bill. I will acknowledge, have not carried the day with that argument. But I just think it's important to explain why we did that. And most of this, I think, will be familiar. You know, kind of backing up a couple of years when the cash fund was started, the concept was that we would, over time, level out and then we reduce our borrowing. That way we would keep the state in the good graces of the rating agencies. We would lower our, cost of borrowing and the like. But we wouldn't reduce our capital investments. The whole idea was not to reduce capital investments, but to pay for them in a different way. Thus was birthed the cash fund. We went through a number of iterations about how we were going to pay for that. The earliest one, I think, was, well, we'll be saving all this money and not issuing debt. So that interest payment will no longer be made. So we'll still account for it, we'll set it aside and send it to the cash fund. So foregone interest and debt service costs would be our way. That proved to be, as I think Nick did a lot of work on that proved to be kind of difficult to account for,
Yeah.
when you retire a bond, just how do you really account for that? You have to make a bunch of assumptions, and pretty soon the number that you have becomes kind of silly. So instead, we ended up on the construct, most of which is in operation today, and that is the 4% construct. And 4% was chosen in large part because that's about what we were paying in service.
Right.
So we thought, all right, so that's what we're paying today. Let's keep that in mind. And so what we proposed was to say 4% of last year's appropriations, kind of the way we calculate the stabilization reserve, it's X percent, up to 5% of last year's appropriations. So we'd say 4% of last year's total appropriations minus what we're paying for debt service.
Right.
So the idea would be that as debt service leveled off and then started to go down, and the general fund every year climbs, 4% minus debt service would get to be a wider and wider amount. And so we put more and more cash into this fund and we'd be pretty bad. That survives in a sense. By that, I mean the House and Senate last year changed that 4% to be up to 4%. So it could be 0% in a tight budget year. It could be 4%. The administration is going to keep to that. I'll tell you, the budget we submit next week, there will be a 4% of last year's appropriations amount in there, which equals this 17.
Roughly this year will be roughly 11 point something.
So call $11.12 million, something along those lines. So we're going to keep to that. Last year, they made it up to 4%, but we think it's important to keep to that. Importantly, also, the concept was, and the risk we took with this proposal was, the idea was not to use the cash fund as additive, but to
Right.
use it as substitutive. That's what we're.
Yeah, it is.
Right, so that, that's the idea. Whether or not that happens, I don't know. The idea, but that's what now in statute, you have up to 4%, the creation of the cash fund happened, Title 32. So that's where we are. Last year, the House and Senate in the bills, the big bill that passed, had quite a few appropriations, capital appropriations paid for the general fund, in the general fund. So in our budget adjustment, we're staying true to what we had originally called for, and we are striking them. We're moving them. We're not getting rid of the appropriation. We're just moving the capital. So
Right.
you'll see that in your document. And that is substantially what you see in section 39 of this document.
If I could jump in, Commissioner, just to clarify, the one-time appropriations that the commissioner is referencing are actually cash fund appropriations. So originally general funded, but through this cash fund that we've proposed in the transfer mechanism. And I would just reiterate, I think the commissioner touched on this. From a very high level, what we're seeing is falling debt authorizations for many good reasons, rising capital costs, both in needs and just construction costs and everything else going up with inflation. And those two curves, like sixth grade math say, those don't work unless there's an alternative funding source. So this is sort of at a high level, I think, why the administration cares so much about this, feels like this should really be codified as a durable construct to fund the capital bill moving forward. The capital needs of the state are not going away. We just need to think of a way to rebalance our portfolio. And so I think specifically what we're here to talk about today, and there will be quite a bit more information coming next Tuesday for capital BAA, but the FY24 operating budget has the last year, as the commissioner said, the last year cash fund appropriations, which got pulled, some of them were authorized in Act 69, the capital bill, but the actual appropriations were made in the big bill. And we're proposing to reverse that, to pull them back into the capital bill. So the appropriations are actually made in the capital bill. And it may seem like kind of a technical thing. The reason we feel so strongly about that and why we're here speaking to this committee is that in order, and I think we saw this a bit last year, this committee may remember, if the appropriations, if a big chunk of the capital bill appropriations are placed in another bill, you're unable to complete the work that you need to do and dial in a capital bill without really close coordination across the hall. And there's no guarantee, given the different time frame that the capital bill is adopted and the operating budget, that changes aren't going to happen, right? Essentially, with the status quo, with current statute, a big chunk and hopefully a bigger chunk of the capital bill moving forward will now be subject to the appropriations bill and all the deliberations in committee of conference. I think it's worth pointing out, for instance, one example, we already saw this in effect last year. There were $10 million of FY25 cash fund appropriations specified in the capital bill. And there was language saying it is the legislative intent for this $10 million of projects to be funded, not in the FY25 operating budget, but actually in the FY24 operating budget. So last year's big bill. That legislative intent language is in the capital bill, pointing hopefully to a funding source. And then as committee of conference unfolded, and there was the budget veto override and some auxiliary bills that swept cash fund balance, that $10 million disappeared, right?
Right.
So one of our challenges this year, as we've drafted the capital BAA, we had to come up with that $10 million, right, to even be able to fund what's already in the bill. So I think that's a good example of the kind of dynamic that, best intentions from all committees aside, there's a different universe of considerations that they're working with across the hall versus this committee. We feel like it's really in the best interests of all committees and the state for the authority for appropriations to sit within the capital committees. It's not to say that the appropriations committees don't control ultimately the general fund faucet, if you will, right? The transfer is always gonna live in the big bill. But so they could control essentially how much water is filling up the bucket. We just think you guys should be the ones figuring out how the bucket is allocated across capital. So it seems like kind of a technical amendment. That's really the thrust behind it.
Committee, very important, and here's the time, right now. Very important that if you don't understand this, you ask enough questions. It's very, very important, because it's a battle that we're gonna have. And there's no bad question. So if you've got any question about any of this stuff, ask the question. We got them right here. And so if there's any part of this that isn't clear to you, or if any part is going through, because this is a battle. And I knew last year was gonna be a battle. Nick, you and I have had conversations about it, Commissioner. I think we had a short different time. I knew last year was gonna be a little bit of a battle because it was the first time and everybody was trying to steal our cash. And I knew from day one, and that's when I did go to Jane Kitchell, Chair of Appropriations, and had that talk with her and said, you know, at the end of the day, we want to keep all of this, knowing full well that probably weren't going to. But this is a year that we battle for it hard. This is a year that we battle to keep our capital bill whole, claw back what had gotten stolen from us. So you're gonna hear a lot of this talk. So if there's any part of this that you don't understand, because as you know, there's lots of this that happens outside of committee when you're talking to other committee members saying, hey, no, that's our capital bill. That's our bill. That's our money. This is what we need to do. And how are we gonna compete as a committee and get done all this work that we need to get done if you guys are trying to steal our cash? So that is why it needs to be you guys need to understand, you know, what the commissioner and Nick are talking about as we move forward, because we are gonna fight this year. And so if there's anytime there's a question, ask the question. There's no bad question. So that is very, very important that you understand, you know, where we're at and how, you know, and what's going on.
If I might, Mr. Chair, there have been, I think, this is a complicated proposal, right? There's the potential for complexity in the way this works. It's already a certain level of complexity, and then I think the final construct last year got even more complex with multiple funds and stuff. So what we've seen, I think, is that complexity leaves plenty of room sometimes for differing interpretations of why something is the way it is, or what statute permits. Like what, for instance, one thing that I've heard as well, any general fund appropriations, all appropriations have to be made in the big bill by law, right? Somebody, I think, has said that, maybe Ledge Council last year. We've had a lot of back and forth since then that I don't believe that to be the case. There are plenty of counter examples to that where we have standalone bills that have appropriations. So things like that get often technical in nature. We're always happy, I think, available to be a resource if there are questions that come up today, outside of today, to kind of gut check. Hey, I'm hearing this. I talked to so-and-so and they said, well, it has to be this way. Chances are good it's something we've thought about and may have a response to if that's helpful.
Yeah, it is helpful.
I think it's also worth mentioning that the original concept of the cash fund was just one cash fund. And it came out, the legislation last year came out with the cash fund with two sub-accounts. You got sub-account A, you got sub-account B. Sub-account B appears to be a holding pen for various and sundry non-capital related initiatives, which is, again, not something we anticipated. Whereas the sub-account A, as they set it up, appears to be what originally was the intention for the cash fund. Basic old capital investments. So I think some of the complexity is unnecessary, frankly.
And correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm gonna ask the question, because I'm asking my committee. Sub-account B was where they were holding the monies to buy down the federal dollars. Wasn't that the funds that they were holding back to buy down and access the 250 million or whatever it was worth of dollars, and that's where they're keeping, that money.
Right, there's 25 million for AOT reserve as match, and then I think 14.5 reserve for ANR. Both for the same federal legislation, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act.
Yeah.
Those match need to come down like.
Right, and that was the match, now I'm remembering, and I might need to have this conversation again, I mean, when does all this need to be decided?
Well, we submitted in BAA several weeks ago, one component of it, but the capital bill budget adjustment will be submitted Tuesday and the budget will be submitted Tuesday. So on the budget, in the budget.
But then we'll get it,
Yeah.
and the other body will get it, and
So
we'll
you
have
guys
it.
have basically a month and a half to,
That's like a year.
There is one piece currently, Senator, at play in that what we're proposing is to remove a chunk of appropriations from the FY 24 big bill. And we'll be restoring them in the capital budget adjustment. So the timing of those is such, we just presented the FY 24 BAA a couple of weeks ago. That's at play, that's working its way through the House. So there is an element of this, which is ostensibly what we're here to speak about today.
Okay,
That is the striking of those pieces.
and is that this
section 30.
30, right,
39? Okay,
so
I do have some questions.
Yeah, right.
and yes, be happy to talk in more detail. Post it.
We don't have it.
Oh, this copy.
And Russ, want
Yeah.
to take one?
So,
Thank you.
so let me just back up just a little bit.
Yeah.
I would love if the state had a multi-year historical actual. It frustrates me very much that we don't have historical information. Because my feeling, my gut is that there's some stuff that was supposed to happen last year that's not happening. And that there's leftover funds. So where do appropriated but not encumbered or spent funds go first? There's a it would go to fund balance, right? Typically,
Right, well, ultimately, it stays in the fund, but oftentimes, I think once a year, I get a note from Joint Fiscal Office saying you have this amount that is unallocated thus far. It was, and they list the original appropriations.
Okay.
Say, do you still need that money? And we answer yes or no.
and if you answer no, what happens to it?
Yeah,
Just to clarify, Senator, which fund are you talking
Just
about? 'Cause there's a couple
really,
different-
I mean, the capital I would like to know because those funds would hopefully stay in the capital fund,
The cash fund specifically, or?
the capital fund. Typically, you would, I mean, the way I understand capital funds is it's a separate fund. But I
So-
think we don't use the word fund that.
It's a little complex, I think, in the case of traditional bonded dollar capital appropriations. Because really what those are is spending authority for departments to go out and make expenditures out of the state's cash balances that would then be reimbursed by borrowing down.
Okay, so it's not truly a
actually
fund.
balance there. So those are a little different, which is just why I asked. like,
Yeah, no, I
the
appreciate
fund,
that.
The transportation fund, the education fund, all of the state's major funds, there's a carry forward process.
Yes.
At the end of the year, if we look at what's been spent, what's left over, departments submit to finance and management and the agency of administration their plan saying, hey, we didn't spend this for this reason, here's what we'd like to spend it on moving forward. And then the Secretary of Administration approves or tweaks, modifies those plans. Funds can be moved forward into the next future year to be spent, or if there's no use for them, and often a department will come forward and say, yeah, we didn't need this, then they're reverted to the bottom line of the fund.
Okay, so what I would call fund balance.
Correct, yeah.
So can they be, if they're not encumbered, if there's not a specific project or a specific, like someone's job, can they continue to another year? Is that under the discretion?
In the major funds, general fund, transportation, education fund, clean water fund, yes, subject to the approval of the Secretary of Administration and Finance and Management. That's that carry forward process that happens at the end of the summer every year. In the capital bill, the spending authority that you all make as part of the capital bill continues on for a certain amount of time. I think with capital appropriations, it's like after 5 years or something, there is a check-in or an automatic.
Yeah,
Because those, the nature of those.
right, that should. So what I heard, and tell me if this is wrong, you can continue, when you carry money forward, if it's not encumbered, that the administration has the authority to spend that money in the next year. That's not typical, that municipalities don't work that way, just. It has to be
Well, we can't-
appropriated each year
We
for
can't
it to be
shift an
spent.
appropriation made for this building, say, to another building without.
Right, but I'm talking about operating funds, cause it would just be
Operating
really
funds, we would
helpful.
still need permission. In other words.
Okay, that
we
makes
Present
sense.
to
It's all
you,
subject.
Okay, so the appropriation lasts a year. The appropriation is still the legislature's.
it's kind of interesting, the default for, in statute for any appropriation is anything unspent reverts. That's the default.
Reverts
What
to
you're calling.
The general
what I'm
fund.
calling the fund balance, which you guys call.
General fund, or the transportation fund.
Okay,
So that's the default. In other
Okay.
words, if we do nothing,
yes,
you'll notice in the budget adjustment document, the last section provides what's called carry forward authority.
okay, good.
And that's in session law because we know that if we don't do that, everything by law reverts to the bottom line.
Unless it's encumbered, but then you
Yeah,
just
unless
have a
it's-
period of
yeah.
time that's like 6 months or something.
That's right. And actually, I think technically even stuff that's encumbered and not spent reverts to the bottom line. So.
Right, after the 6
Technically.
months, I mean, but you have some time in the next fiscal year to spend it, right?
Uh,
You should,
I
because
don't know.
otherwise there's no point to uncovering it.
Well, sometimes it's encumbered because you have a project and
Oh, yeah,
requires more time to take.
yeah,
But my point there is that the default in statute is reversion. The legislature always provides, or I don't know, my experience anyway, provides carry forward authority to allow us to carry forward.
okay, so
But
that,
some stuff we don't carry. This year we're reverting about $51 million or something.
okay,
just-
so, all right,
But in
so,
the capital bill, it's no different. I mean, that automatically, continues with a project, but there is a reallocation for unused funds
right,
that happens
right, and it's just a longer timeline.
typically.
And I
Yeah.
believe
Yeah.
there's a legislative repro committee that looks pretty aggressively every year at how are we doing on capital projects? What's being spent? Are there projects that we're under budget? It kind of does that annual housekeeping to see, are we carrying forward spending authority needlessly? Is there stuff that could be reallocated to other capital projects moving forward? You'll see, for instance, in the capital BAA section, well, it was in the capital budget last year, section 17, I think, 16 or 17 is the
Right.
reallocation section,
Right.
right? So similar, we will have some more reallocations this year based on conversations with.
The House counterparts actually break down into subcommittees and scrub it and do that.
Okay,
Yeah.
and I didn't mean this question to take this long,
Okay,
so.
respond.
No, that's all right.
I want you to ask
So-
questions.
Maybe these exist, but just year to year expenditures would be just super helpful, actual expenditures, not budget. Cause what I've seen anyway is year to year budget, which is good. But what's better to me is actual. Actually, what's really better is both, seeing both. So that's just a request on my part.
Do you
And
have specific areas you'd like to see, Senator? I think
well,
part of the challenge is there's thousands of expenditure accounts.
Right.
So I think the short answer is yes, we can always provide actuals going back. Our financial system tracks actual.
good. I was just, well, for one thing, I'm really hoping that you guys are keeping track.
Oh,
I'm
for-
assuming
for
that you
sure.
are.
It's just a vast universe of data, so if there are
Totally
specific
understand.
areas, you're like, well, what did we spend in this year? That's.
Yes, that would be great. Well, actually wastewater, those grants, although they're not operating, so it's not as applicable. But that's really good to know, and I'll let you know when there's something in particular. So the funds that we were looking at, not the funds, the projects, I had concerns last year about keeping things in their fund. I mean, transportation projects should be paid with transportation fund money. revenues. That's the point of funds. So just a comment is some of this, and I just heard about this issue, so I don't know enough. But I'm guessing that some of it might be just not abiding by procedures that you would normally do, right? I mean, you don't have a transportation fund or any special fund unless you expect to have enough revenues to cover the expenditures. That's the point of a fund, right? So if we're getting out of that process or those lanes, that causes problems. And then a capital fund, I know this is simplistic, but a capital fund the same way. It should be a separate income.
But you gotta remember, there's gonna be some commingling between departments because we're the building part of it.
But
I mean,
you
that's
can-
where the,
I understand that. I'm just
I know what you're
making a
trying,
point
I know what you're trying to
that
get to,
there's-
I know what you're saying.
Okay,
And,
good.
so I understand what you're trying to get to, but there will be some there are gonna be some
Oh, yeah,
commingling of funds, because we're the building people. I mean, we're the, but anyways.
and that's fine. It just seems like we're not abiding by our standards.
So if I might respond,
Yes.
Senator, I think, I think the point that you're making is actually exactly part of what we're emphasizing with our proposal. Just to unpack that one example, and I'm sure there's many, like the transportation fund, right?
Yes,
Transportation fund exists, there's a statutory codified purpose for the fund, those are generally funds, and it's not my wheel of expertise, but my understanding is it funds, operating expenses related to transportation, right? Distinct from, for instance, major capital projects that might intersect transportation world, and there's a possibility those might exist then in the capital budget, which has its own statutory purpose. The cash fund, and this is the first paragraph here, was set up to, among other things, this is the current statutory language, defray the costs of future capital expenditures that would otherwise be authorized in the Capital Construction Act and paid for using the state's general obligation bonding authority. That's the description of the cash fund currently in law, which we feel like is a pretty good, to your point, indication that these appropriations should be in the capital bill, right? They're defraying appropriations that would otherwise be in the capital bill, so they should themselves be in the capital bill. The idea of staying in the lane in terms of the use of the fund, we feel like is sort of pointing two red fingers to this cash fund should be.
sure,
And I think
but
that's kind of, we're coming from, I think, the same
And
place.
you
But
have
last
another
year we
set of
put-
papers for, Senate Press.
last year we put transportation projects in
There were,
some were in it, one was in the capital, and then I guess others ended up in general.
that I believe
So-
last year there were a couple of one.
Maybe transportation needs a capital plan.
They-
How have you funded transportation capital projects in the past?
They've borrowed, I mean.
But the transportation fund has funded them, right?
And I believe at one point there was also a transportation infrastructure bond fund,
Hmm,
which continues to be part of the debt service. that we
Okay.
pay off.
So exactly what you're saying, the reason why it crossed is because they took the money and that's how another committee decided that they were gonna spend that money. So you're on the right path as far as willing to battle to put it back in the lanes, as you're saying. So that's exactly what these guys are saying. These guys are saying, listen, that money was meant for capital, the capital bill. People came in, took that money and decided to switch some projects around, make sub-accounts and do this and do that. So they basically took your money and used it for other projects. And so exactly what you're fighting for right now and exactly what you're talking about is exactly what these guys are trying to do. They're trying to pull that money back in, put it in the right lanes and make our capital bill whole again.
yeah, I'm not making a comment on who did something right or wrong. I'm just talking about the philosophy of the funds. I would like to know more.
I think we'd certainly be happy to follow up with that.
Okay,
Okay, we good for a minute?
yes, thank you.
Moving on, what else?
I think we've said our piece.
Okay.
We just wanted to make sure you knew why we submitted this budget adjustment in there. You know, going forward, our budget will reflect this feeling. We're going to put aside another 4%. We're going to, direct it to the capital bills.
Yeah.
And, we hope that it will be this committee that will determine how those projects are spent. Again, getting to the point where it doesn't matter whether we're borrowing for it or just paying for it up front. If it's a capital project, we believe it should be allocated and appropriated by the capital committee, you know, the institutions committee.
I would just reemphasize the offer to the committee. Since there is a lot going on, you can see lots of moving pieces, open door, always happy to follow up.
Senator Renner will watch.
Yeah, it's just hard to find.
Senator
time.
Renner will watch the tape and so that she can get up on the conversation. And Senator Renner, as I said, there's gonna be not that we're not able to do it, because we are, but there's gonna be a lot of complex things that are going on. These guys are fighting a little bit of a battle to keep our capital bill whole, and last year it got away from us a little bit. New ideas and a bunch of cash floating around, and but this year we're gonna fight a little bit harder for that. So but what I will say is that you need to make sure that if you have any questions, as you said, as Nick has said, he'll make himself available. We need to make sure that we really understand what we're talking about, because there is a lot of work that gets done outside of this committee as you're talking to other people, and they're after what you're trying to accomplish, what you're trying to do, and you need to fight for it. So yep.
Just one last thing,
Yep.
Mr. Chair. So just so that I understand, these are the projects and allocations, appropriations that you are proposing to remove from the fill in the blank.
This was meant, and we didn't really have time to get into detail. This is meant really as a instructive aid for you all this is just looking at what was passed in legislation last year. So the first column is projects that were listed in the capital bill that this committee worked hard on. You can see they go down to a certain point. And then the second column is what was included, the appropriations actually in Act 78. You can see there's some additional ones from the cash loan that weren't mentioned in the capital bill. And so I think it's fair to say what we will be proposing is to pull anything, to your point, Senator, that is truly a capital project that was made in Act 78 back into the capital bill in the capital BAA that we're presenting. And so there are a couple of these.
This would go to this? Is that,
Well, those.
are you trying to revert to this?
Yes, but largely this first column, those would just transfer over. The current languages, they're authorized in the capital bill and appropriated in the big bill. Just like they should be appropriated in the capital bill. And then some of those that are highlighted at the bottom, I think are more of the projects you were describing that aren't specifically capital. They're made out of cash fund B. We
Okay.
don't think those should be in the capital bill because those are not capital projects. So we'll be leaving those in the big bill, but anything that is truly a capital bill project, the two that are highlighted in blue are more capital projects that were, for instance, made in the big bill last year, but not even mentioned in the capital bill.
Like the St. Albans garage?
Right.
Yeah, that was one that I thought should have been.
And to your point, I think last year was an extraordinary year in terms of revenues. And so a lot of what happens in that scenario is that if you've got overflowing revenues here and maybe dwindling here, there is sometimes some movement of funds. I think we are returning much closer to like a normal business as usual revenue picture this year, which is why we feel like even more so, we've got to get dialed in on these fundamentals of the mechanics of how these work moving forward.
If you read through section 39 of the BAA, what's highlighted here are what was not included.
What was not, I'm sorry,
Crossed out.
crossed out.
Because
Okay.
that we believe should have to stay in the appropriations bill, because they are more considered to be traditional appropriations and really have limited exposure or relevance to the capital bill, but everything else, like represents Crosshouse, and we would prefer to move into the capital. So that is,
Okay,
as you read through section. 50,
Okay.
you'll find this clarity.
okay, thank you.
So there will be another version of this table with capital bill BAA, tax BAA in our capital BAA submission. So this is what's public.
Okay.
You have one more of these sheets for, or we can just make copies for Senator Renner.
Sure, yeah, I believe they're posted to the.
It's on, they're all posted on your page.
Okay, there, okay,
Thank you guys.
So much.
thank you,
Yeah.
thank you for coming in, appreciate it very much.
Well, we teed up the main show here.
That's right.
Yeah,
Anything with cash money.
yeah, thank you very much for coming. Ms. Sheets, how are you?
I'm very fine, thank you.
Yes, glad to have you. Thank you for coming.
Brought along some friends of mine.
Yeah, I see them. Your friends are our friends.
Indeed,
Yeah,
I would hope
how
so.
are
doing today?
I would hope so.
yes. So, Mr. Sheets, what brings you in here today?
I heard from Linda Lehman, who procured me for this time slot.
Are you uncovered?
That you want to hear about the interpretive plan, but I'm willing to talk
That was
about
exactly-
whatever it is that you want me to talk about. So David Sheets, I'm Vermont State Curator for the record. I think I have happy news for you. We hope to complete the interpretive plan in the coming weeks. We're only a couple weeks away from, I think, being able to roll it out. It first has to go to Jennifer at BGS for a quick review by the executive branch before it is rolled out to the legislative branch. But we're very close, and what I will say this, that it's a lot more than an interpretive plan, meaning that considering the potential of my office giving way to a possible new occupant in another year or so, I wanted this exercise to be a lot more expansive than just interpreting the State House. And part of the conversation, of course, has to do with the conversations we've had for a number of years now about where the State House is headed, both architecturally as well as interpretation and other things that hover over the building. And I want that. Yeah.
For the record, my name is Jennifer Fitch, Commissioner of the Department of Buildings and General Services. The interpretive plan was a couple of years ago, so there may be
Sure.
people on the committee that don't even know
I was gonna
what the
ask you,
interpretive plan
if you
is,
would
how it
just-
came to be.
and then the millions that are watching on TV.
Million.
Yeah, the millions that are watching on TV, if you could spend some moments.
Whoa,
And then,
you're scaring me now, Senator. All right. No, the interpretive plan actually grew out of an exercise that actually goes back to 6, 7 years ago. In fact, the moment that it maybe was born was an encounter in Lieutenant Governor David Zuckerman's office with a staffer who is no longer there in his previous term. So he left that office in the meantime, but this was 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago. And that encounter was a person who was connected with the Abenaki people. And they wondered about some gifts that had been given to the governor upon the state finally recognizing the Abenakis as the indigenous people of Vermont. And I explained politely, as I had done for decades, that small objects that are given to the governor, generally speaking, would migrate to the Vermont Historical Society, which is charged with interpreting the big picture, interpretation, but the big picture of Vermont's past. And this person challenged me on that. And we began to walk around the State House, looking at it through her eyes. And I recognized that we had had, up until that point, a very conservative view of what belonged in the State House and what did not. And that conservative view meant that we were somehow in need of ensuring that the walls were covered with a portrait of every governor of Vermont, no matter what, every governor, even the ones who had come and gone without a portrait finding its way to the walls of the State House. And I started to put together a task force, and that task force is a group of colleagues of mine in other branches of other departments, rather, of state government, such as the State Historic Sites, the Vermont Historical Society, who have always been close partners in this building with us, and others. And representatives of the Abenaki people, of people of color, women, all of the designations that are not very apparent on the walls of the State House. And then one of the early members of that group was Senator Ruth Hardy, began to come to our meetings, and Ruth ushered the bill through that asked for this interpretive plan, specifically this interpretive plan. But the conversation started in our curatorial task force. So now we're about to roll out something that is all about what the visitor experience to the State House ought to be in as expansive a way as possible. So that means understanding who your audiences are. And in a building as complex as a state capitol, this is not merely a museum interpretive plan. The interpretive plans are fairly standard in the museum world. But when you have a building that is more than a museum, and yet a building, I might argue, that 40 years ago when I first came here was not acknowledged as a museum. Consequently, I was hired only after quite a bit of friction over whether the State House needed a curator or not. Happily now, I think everyone understands this is a museum, but it is so much more. And consequently, an interpretive plan for a building like this is not run of the mill. And when we went out there to see what other state capitals had for interpretive plans, unable to find a single example that we might use as the basis, and part of that had to do with the recognition that when you enter into plans for something, generally it is the act of building something or redesigning something that causes you to think about an interpretive plan. So when we would encounter one, it would be completely morphed by a grand plan for redoing a building, for completely architecturally altering that building. And I totally understand why that is the case, because that has been our experience in working on this for the last couple of years, is that happily you and the Sergeant at Arms and BGS have all engaged in conversations about the future for this building, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and rearranging this building consequently in ways that none of us ever saw happening before the pandemic. And we're about to enter yet another phase of that conversation. And I think this interpretive plan will help keep us focused on what is most important. And that is, at its center, at its core, it's about ensuring that every Vermonter feels that this building belongs to them. And not only does it belong to them, but it is a place where they feel welcome, feel a part of what is going on in it. That's where we cross the line from being a mere museum to being the home of Vermont's democratic institutions of government. And engaging in the legislative process is very much at the heart of what we're trying to interpret here. For many of our audiences, not the least of which is the largest school audience in Vermont by far. We get more school students to this site than any other in the state. My colleagues over at the Shelburne Museum, for example, have an entire department devoted to education. We have one person part-time who works in the Sergeant at Arms office, is supervised by me, and makes all the arrangements for school visits to Montpelier, not just to this building, but also to our partners at the Vermont Historical Society, their museum, as well as the Supreme Court, where they do a mock trial for many of the school groups that come through. So that's just one audience, the school audience, which is a big one during your time in the building. Happily, many of our audiences stay away from the State House while you're here, and they come during the summer and the fall when our traditional tourist season, when frankly, this very small State House is able to take in more people. That would be challenging during this time of the year. We can't really do both the tourist season and the legislative season at the same time. Thus, the different seasons help us with our interpretation. So with democracy at the core of interpretation, we also want the walls to reflect what is going on. We created the Abenaki display in the staircase. We created just the very year of the lockdown, the centennial of women having the right to vote, telling the story of how women gained political power in this building such that the zenith was accomplished during the pandemic with Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, with Pro Tem Becca Ballant, and all of the money committees chaired by women, all of the majority and minority leaders, women. And that is part of the State House, but we have so much more to do to attempt to shift things around. And consequently, I have been incredibly excited, so excited that the thought of retiring is not very acceptable to me right now. I don't particularly want to pass this along quite yet. So the very act that we're going to be rolling this plan out in a few weeks is going to enter a new phase where we're going public. And I see working with your committee, with Ruth's committee across the way, with the Legislative Advisory Committee on the State House. All of these will be the ways for this conversation to go public for the first time. And I'm ready for that. I am ready for a very robust discussion of why what we celebrate at the State House has never been more important than it is right now in this state that still seems to understand what that means. Other parts of the country, I have a lot more doubt about their ability to withstand the forces that are at work right now in our society. And it gives comfort to me to know that here, at least, we will be going forth with something that supports civics education, working with the Agency of Education to ensure that all Vermont students at least understand what this is all about and why the stakes are so incredibly important. Nothing less than that is about to be rolled out. And
You're setting the bar very high.
Yeah.
so anyway, it is in a graphic designer's hands right now, because we also recognize that plans that are not visually interpreted are likely to not be read. So we are ensuring that this document is lively enough. It won't be quite as lively as this, but it will have lots of photographs. It will have charts. It has a number of things that are going to help everybody understand what is the State House? Why do we have it? What deserves to be in the State House and what does not in a building as small as this? Who should be on the walls of the State House? This is a huge question, and we don't have all the answers by any stretch. We ask, in fact, more questions in the plan than we have answers for. But we have set up some processes that will ensure that past our lives, there's guidance given to those who come after us in terms of answering some of those questions, because it's always going to change. Obviously, 100 years ago, nobody thought that having more women on the walls of the State House was all that important at a time when women were barely engaged in the process. But now we're at a very different point, and we looked at our world very differently, and consequently the State House needs to change along with our own understanding of what the world is like. Alexander Twilight, that portrait is a perfect example of something that is about us. It is not about his time, because he was here for 1 year. All of you, I think, have served longer than Alexander Twilight. And yet there he is, bigger than life, in the main lobby of the State House. And it's all about race. That's why he's there. But fortunately for us, we can talk about him as a human being who was incredibly involved in his community, as all of you are, and who came to Montpelier, as maybe you have, because he needed money for his community. And he was going to go home to Brownington with money that would keep his school going. That was his objective. And it didn't go well for him. Consequently, he didn't run for re-election the next year. This is at a time when legislators just had single-year terms. So he served 1 year in the State House, and yet here he is, bigger than life in the main lobby, having displaced after almost 100 years, a Spanish-American war admiral who was a war hero, displaced from the lobby, I might add, but not necessarily from the State House, because the interpretive plan talks a little bit about our biggest collection, which are portraits of governors, 80 some of which are found throughout the building, and military figures. And we're attempting to consolidate the military storytelling upstairs near the Cedar Creek room, where it belongs, but not spread it throughout the building. So Admiral Dewey is the next one, probably to be dislodged from the main lobby. And that means we have a prime opportunity for yet another portrait, which in the plan I will reveal to this committee, is likely to be a woman.
Nice.
And yet that in itself is not an easy decision in terms of who that woman ought to be. So we're setting up a little bit of a process to ensure that everybody has a little bit of a say in terms of determining who that woman ought to be. But it's about our time. It's who we think in 2024 is the right candidate for something like that. And I will say this, 50 years from now, they may look back at us and say, what were they thinking? And then, guess what? They'll write a new interpretive plan.
They might say, what took so long? That's what they might say.
Right.
So we can look at this interpretive plan almost as, because we've all been involved with town politics, as a town plan.
Yes.
So is it suggestions? Is it anything binding?
No.
So it's basically a plan
It's
of.
very open-ended.
Yep.
I would say. So it's setting up processes for making decisions like the one out in the main lobby. It's also, though, looking at the building architecturally and ensuring that the building is open to those in wheelchairs, to people who need assistance to understand what they're looking at within the building. Ensuring that we are as accessible to the public as a building can possibly be in this, the most important public building in the state.
Mhm.
And if we can't say that everybody is welcome here in all ways, then that's kind of what this plan is about.
And when will this plan be unveiled?
So middle of February, I think, is the likely time when it'll go public.
Yep.
In the meantime, it'll be reviewed by a few folks before that.
Fair enough.
All right.
Yep. Questions? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a storytelling plan, how we tell the story of Vermont in the State House. I'm just trying to think of a
Yeah.
synonym because the word interpretive can be interpreted all kinds of ways.
You got it. And that's what museums do, right? Museums are about telling stories. So it is very much identifying potential stories,
Okay.
but not suggesting always what those stories ought to be. So one of the reasons that this has to be tied to some extent to decisions yet to be made for the State House is that rooms 9, 10, and 11 were once general use rooms that actually were used by my office prior to the pandemic because of their location right off the main lobby for a special show, for example, that we would occasionally do in particularly room 11. If we take down governor's portraits, which are heavy in room 11 and room 10, we open up the possibility to using those rooms as rotating gallery spaces. And instead of, we don't have gallery spaces in the State House, generally speaking. So this report reveals that we want to use these rooms for multiple purposes. That's a time-honored tradition in the State House. One of the things that Nancy and I grappled with when we wrote this book was we needed to answer the question, if the legislative session was held in late October, early November, right after the harvest came in, but before the snow would make it impossible to get to Montpelier from all of the communities throughout Vermont. They had a 2-week session back in 1859 when the State House was built. 2 weeks. And they built all of this for a mere 2 weeks. So the big question was, what did they use the State House for the rest of the year? And it's exactly what you suggest, Russ. They saw the State House as the biggest town hall that Vermont has. And what do we use our town halls for? All kinds of things, right? All kinds of things. And they used the State House for all kinds of things. Meetings took place in all the chambers. Farmers' Night grew out of many of the performances that took place here back in the 19th century. So we're still using the State House the way it was intended to be used from the outset. We now reserve a much larger part of the calendar for the legislative exercise than was the case back then. But happily, the original chairs in the House chamber in particular are still there, which mean that we can't possibly stay in the building longer than May, June at the most, or they'll have to visit a chiropractor after that. And that has kept our citizen-based legislature what it needs to continue to be in a state where we are blessed to enjoy the close and amazing, intimate connections that you all have with your communities that allow Vermonters, at least, to appreciate what that is, because we're so close and we're so small in scale that it's easy for us compared to other parts of the country. And that's one of the things that this interpretive plan is about, the celebration of community in a state that prizes community, and how the State House is, as grand as it may be, is very much just a big old grand town hall and used for the same purposes largely. That's a good thing.
Any more questions for Mr. Sheets?
Always a pleasure.
Mr. Sheets, I will say this. I'm glad that this work has revitalized you. I'm glad it's made you second guess your departure, because you, sir, are a treasure. And thank you for what you do.
Thank you
for your passion that you bring. Thank you for the passion. Thank you for what you've done with this building. Thank you for your 40 years.
You're welcome.
And we'd like to have another 40 of you.
Well, I'll see what I can do. With my boss over here, I feel privileged to continue to serve, and she's been injecting a lot of positive energy that has also kept me going. And conscious that I need to leave the office in a certain way for my successor to succeed. And that is something that I'm afraid a lot of people like me spend too little time worrying about what's going to happen after they're gone. this has been about my departure. It's good to think that way. So that you're conscious that what you've always taken for granted in terms of the way you operate can't be taken for granted because other people do things differently and you need to leave your office such that they stand a chance of succeeding.
Give them a plan.
And she's all about that. So I want that to happen and I'll be working on that as soon as this is off my plate and working more toward that end as well.
And to clarify, it's so that his legacy will live long beyond David's time with BGS in the state of Vermont.
Indeed. I did bring another copy of Intimate Grandeur because I know that this is your Bible
Yeah,
in here in this room. So this is your committee room copy.
thank you.
Linda will keep it
Yeah,
wherever
we'll keep it
you
right
think
now.
it should be
Yeah, absolutely.
for ongoing reference
Yeah.
as you deliberate
Thank you.
on matters important.
Thank you.
And
sir.
interpretive.
Thank you. And interpret.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate you very much.
Indeed.
Okay, committee, I think that kind of cleans us up here for today. And did you have anything for us?
No, I was gonna hang out for